to kind of take a look at biblical texts that have a tie to uncertainty, the idea of unfairness at times. And Ecclesiastes and Job are the two that kind of most directly seem pessimistic. And Ecclesiastes is shorter, and Ecclesiastes is easier. So I figured we'd start there, and then we could look at Job as we move forward, because Job is 4 times the length of Ecclesiastes and has lots and lots and lots of issues with how well the text has survived over time. So it's just kind of easier to start with Ecclesiastes and then move forward. So I'm calling it Biblical Skeptics. I'm not 100% sure by the time we get to the end, you'll actually think Ecclesiastes is a skeptic, to kind of not bury the lead. So goals, I tend to put goals up. Goals for tonight are kind of learn about the structure and possible sources, hypotheses about when it was written and by whom. We don't have names exactly. Understand kind of how it hangs together as a literary work and the devices that Ecclesiastes uses, because the same devices that Ecclesiastes uses are going to be used a lot in the book of Job. And then understanding kind of the basic ideas and thinking through what that means for the book, what that means for our own perspectives. And if all you know of Ecclesiastes is turn, turn, turn by the birds, well, that's a start. Before we get going, which version should I read sometimes comes up. You can find all kinds of translations for free online of all the biblical texts. For easy access for Jewish use, I usually suggest Sepharia, which has the Tanakh and the Talmud and lots and lots and lots of texts, and it has commentaries and whatever else. Sepharia uses the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society translation. The JPS translation is fine. The way the JPS translation works is if the results of modern linguistic scholarship don't give them an answer, they tend to just look at whatever's in the traditional commentary written by Rashi in the 1000s and just resolve it that way. So sometimes their resolutions are more steeped in tradition than they are in what we know about ancient Near Eastern languages. Robert Alter, who has written a number of books about the Bible as literature, recently finished, a couple of years ago, a 3-volume translation of the whole Tanakh, a complete retranslation. And his translation of Ecclesiastes is the one that I'll be using tonight, because it does some things with literary devices and language that I think are very good and very helpful for getting a feel for what's happening in the Hebrew, even if you can't read the Hebrew. And unusually, Robert Alter says, actually, the King James is pretty good here. That's often not the case, but it actually is pretty good here. Although the language that the King James Bible uses is a little archaic, and sometimes we don't fully get what they mean when they say a word. My favorite example is the word cleave, which can mean both to cling to someone and to cut something apart. We tend as moderns to think cutting things apart rather than clinging to. It's a little bit archaic. There are many other examples. The King James's English was old when it was translated, because they were trying to use older English to make it more florid and fancy. So it was even older than Shakespeare's English, essentially. Okay, so structure, sources, dating, authorship. It's useful to know some of this background because there are disputes about who did what and how old things are. if you were to just sit down and read the book, this is kind of the structure. There's an introductory poem. There's a thing saying, oh, I'm the person who wrote it. We get a lot of, I've looked at everything in life and here's what life is like. We get a lot of conclusions. Here's what you should do in life, kind of advice. There's a concluding poem and there's an epilogue, and the epilogue is thought widely to not really be part of the book, or thought widely by modern scholars to not really be part of Ecclesiastes, that it may have been added on in order to make it hang together with the rest of the biblical literature. I'm skeptical, but it's the generally accepted view. Ecclesiastes moves between poetry and prose. It is not always clear when he's doing poetry and when he's doing prose. Every translation is a guess. Every layout of the Hebrew Bible is actually a guess as well. So if I were to hold up this page, okay, so this is a Hebrew version of it. And Robert Alter translates this entire page as prose, but you can see that this looks more arranged like poetry than it does prose, right? The line breaks cut off a little bit earlier on the page, the way you would expect poetry to, as opposed to prose, because that's how it's laid out in the manuscript that this is based off of. So it's really hard to draw lines between parts of Ecclesiastes and go, well, this is definitely poetry and this is definitely prose. Even his prose is has a very particular kind of style to it that's very Hebrew poetry-like. And then Ecclesiastes switches between third and first person references. So he will actually say, I, Kohelet, blah, 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 blah. Kohelet says, blah, 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 blah. And then he'll also say, I have investigated life. So there have been attempts to say this is two different works because maybe they were sewn together. There's one person calling himself Kohelet and another I. I'm not convinced. It kind of all holds together. I mentioned that modern scholars tend to argue that some things are inserted, maybe to make it more acceptable as part of biblical canon. No one's really left their name on this thing. The closest we have is the opening verse says, the words of Kohelet, son of David, who was king in Jerusalem, which means that there's a traditional take on it that King Solomon was the author. There is another traditional take that says the book of Isaiah, several of the prophets, and Ecclesiastes were all from King Hezekiah, which seems to mean that the rabbis maybe thought it was edited during that period, which means they still might think Solomon wrote it. There are some problems with that view in terms of the evidence that we've got about the book itself. This would date the literature to about 930 BCE, if Solomon were to have written it. We have some significant problems with that with the language. Two of them are there's a lot of Aramaic vocabulary, and there's some Persian vocabulary. And the other part is there's Aramaic grammatical structure, and Aramaic affected Hebrew primarily after the Babylonian exile, so after 586. So linguistically, there are issues with saying, oh, it's definitely King Solomon's. There are particular parts that use words that are now very common parts of Hebrew, but they are very common parts of Hebrew now because they're in Kohelet, not because they were necessarily native Hebrew words. So the word pardes, the word pidgam are the primary Persian loanwords. They're very common in modern Hebrew. They exist only in Kohelet in the Tanakh. So they became common because Kohelet used them, not because they were really part of Hebrew. There is no Greek, so people feel pretty good about saying, well, it definitely has to be from before Alexander the Great. It's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know it exists by 150 BCE. We actually know it exists a little earlier than that in transmitted documents. The only book of the Tanakh that isn't at the Dead Sea Scrolls, in at least a fragment, is the book of Esther. So Kohelet was clearly accepted, Ecclesiastes was clearly accepted by everybody early enough that no one really disputed that this should be part of the Tanakh, including the folks who are members of the Dead Sea Scrolls sect who were idiosyncratic, I think is the best way of putting them as a bunch. So I'm going to switch between Kohelet and Ecclesiastes. They mean exactly the same thing. They both mean assembler or gatherer. Kohelet as a Hebrew grammatical word here does not make a lot of sense because Kohelet is a feminine form and it is not a transitive verb, so it means more like a female person who is part of an assembly rather than a female person who assembles. Ecclesiastes is just the Greek version of it. Ecclesia is the Greek word that means church. In the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it is also the word that is used to refer to the congregation when they are wandering in the wilderness. So if you aren't careful about how you translate the Greek, you start saying that the Israelites had a church that was wandering through the desert. It's a little bit ahistorical. But like most biblical books, there's a lot we don't really know. It's not like we have an original manuscript that says, I am the person who wrote this. Congratulations. And if we did have such a thing, most biblical scholars would be inclined to distrust it because that's way too obvious an answer. Okay, so there's a bunch of Ecclesiastes I've said that's in poetry, and even the stuff that's not in poetry is poetic. So there's a bunch of traits, and these are important when we look at the book of Job, so I felt like we had to have them up front. There are a bunch of things that Ecclesiastes is doing that are kind of part and parcel of a lot of this kind of literature. This is from a genre called wisdom literature. So Proverbs is written a little bit like this as well. So there's parallelism, and we'll actually take apart a text and see what I'm talking about with each of these terms, but I don't want you to never have heard them before I start saying them. So parallelism, which is the idea that you kind of repeat themes, is part of almost all Hebrew poetry. It's all over the place in the Psalms. Repetition of words or sounds. So Hebrew poetry does not tend to rhyme at the ends of lines the way we're accustomed to with English poetry. It instead rhymes internally. Hebrew words in poetry tend to be shorter because it's easier to arrange those sets of syllables. The longer your syllables get, the less punchy the poetry sounds in Hebrew. Sometimes grammatical features are fudged. And then you have to do a little bit of guessing sometimes with the Hebrew. And then the imagery is fairly material. So even though Ecclesiastes is kind of a philosophical book, it doesn't use abstract language. He spends a lot of time kind of giving you very naturalistic analogies for things rather than really, really long words that are kind of confusing. So this is all more easily seen by actually looking at something. So this is from the opening poem. This is the first few verses of the opening poem. And looking at it, you can see the repetition in themes. So merest breath, merest breath, merest breath, all is mere breath. This, by the way, you have probably heard translated as vanity. So vanity, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This is one of those changes in vocabulary that makes it hard for us to figure out what someone means. What gain is there? Generation goes and a generation comes. So you can see even in English, the vocabulary repeats. And then when you look at it in Hebrew, this first line almost sounds like a sigh. So it's Havel Havalim Amar Kohelet. Havel Havalim, Hakol Havel. So it's, everything is just a bummer, which is essentially what this first line means. Everything is pointless. He's the biblical Holden Caulfield, for those of you who've read Catcher in the Rye. You know, the last verse, Holech Hadarom, V'sovev L'tzafon, Sovev, Sovev, Holech HaRuach, V'al Savivotav Shav HaRuach. This, we're going to say these words over and over, and we're going to use the sounds over and over to kind of emphasize what's happening in the imagery of the poetry. I talked about parallelism. So this is actually an example of parallelism. This is verse 5. So the sun rises and the sun sets, and to its place it glides, and there it rises. So I've got the sun rises, and there it rises in red. And I have the sun sets, and to its place it glides in yellow, so that you can see the themes swap place from line 1 to line 2. And when you swap the places, you get an X shape, which is the Greek letter chi, which is why it's called chiastic parallelism, because it ends up looking like an X if you just draw lines. Seriously, I had to go to grad school to learn that. No, I was undergrad, but it's still like somebody got college tuition to teach me X's mean C. And you can see it as well in the Hebrew. Here we have the red and the yellow kind of going back and forth. Note, I'll read the Hebrew out loud and you can kind of note the punchy 2-syllable words. So, V'zerach Hashemesh, Uva Hashemesh, Ve'el Makomo Sho'ef, Zoreach Husham. So, short words, pretty punchy to get everything across. And as I said before, verse 2 is this like, ugh. Like it actually has that sound to it, this everything is pointless kind of a feel to it. And this is translated, Robert Alter translate this as mere breath. Modern translators have dropped saying vanity, because we now think of vanity as being vain, which is empty, but we also think of it as being kind of like egotistical and self-centered. That word has shifted its meaning. Modern translators occasionally say things like absurdity, but that's really not Kohelet's kind of imagery. Kohelet doesn't use abstract concepts. He really likes concrete things. So Robert Alter says breath. Everybody understands breath. And look at this word, havel. So that's how he's getting that translation. I think it's actually a pretty good one if you're not going to go with the vanity one. So I'm going to unmute. Do we have questions up to this point? I can't see everyone all at once when I'm using the PowerPoint thing, unfortunately.
Right. I have a technical question if somebody can answer me. The end of the line is hidden underneath the pictures of the people, of the participants. How can I do anything about it?
Ami, if you go to the kind of the top of the row of pictures, you'll see these rectangles. And if you hit the single rectangle, everybody's picture goes away.
Single rectangle, this one.
It's a single thin rectangle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on the far left.
It's on the far left at the top of the row of pictures.
Yeah, see.
Yeah.
This will be. All right.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay.
And then if you want them to come back, when you go to the top, you hit the box of 2 parallel rectangles.
Okay. Thank you.
That brings everybody back.
Yeah, I have my Brady Bunch view on, so I can see a few more of you. Okay.
So Jeremy,
yeah.
I'm trying to parse the idea of vanity and breath being similar.
Mm-hmm.
I'm having trouble with that.
So I think part of it is that vanity has changed meanings for us, right? So a vanity can now be the table in your bedroom where you have a mirror and you put on makeup. Vanity can be, oh, that person's so vain, right? That Carly Simon song. It just changed meanings. And it makes us puzzled to then say, well, mere breath. And basically what's happened is he's saying, you know, this is the book that uses that word the most. We have to find a way of translating this that makes actual sense. So if you had come to this cold and never seen the King James Version and no one had ever said vanity of vanities to you, mere breath would probably catch it better than somebody saying vanity as a 21st century reader.
So sort of as something lightweight. I'm trying to.
Yeah, lightweight, completely immaterial, completely
Pointless.
Transitory.
How about the word vain? It's the same term, right? So all is in vain? Would that be it?
That would work too. But again, Robert Alter's take on this, which I kind of like, which is why I keep using it, is, you know, he never uses abstract terminology, right? Vain, we've already had to kind of parse the word vain and the word vanity. That's not a biblical Hebrew word, because biblical Hebrew doesn't have abstract philosophic terminology for the most part. So why would we translate it that way? Right? Modern Hebrew gets it and rabbinic Hebrew gets it, but biblical Hebrew kind of doesn't have that. And so his take on it is we need a more naturalist, materialist kind of word that reflects the idea of transitory emptiness.
If I may contribute to this one thing, is that it became in contemporary Hebrew, it became an idiom, the hevel peh. So this is the breath of your mouth when you say something that is just like without much thinking about it. So I think the breath per Hebrew makes more sense.
Oh, cool.
Thank you.
Okay, so now it's your turn. No one told you there was going to be an assignment, right? But it's not learning to read a text if you're not forced to read a text. So take a few moments to look at something you already know, because it's from turn. I know you know this. And see if you can find parallels from verse to verse and within verses. See if you can figure out what he's trying to say and how the language helps get that across. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to puzzle over it, and then we'll compare notes. I wish I had a Jeopardy timer. Do. Okay, so who wants to kind of share what they think? I know no one wants to share what they think, but don't make me call on somebody. Ami.
Yeah. Well, to me, when I look at it, it's almost as if he's answering himself. In the first page, first chapter, and he's asking, "What's the point of all of this?" And it's always, he always come back. What happened before will happen again, and in here he's sort of answering himself. Okay, yes, all of it starting and ending and coming again, but there's a time for everything. That's my read of it.
Yeah. Does anybody see parallels in the individual verses? Because each line is a verse. And it's fair if you say no, because you're probably not
looking at I was just looking at a time to kill and a time to heal, and then a time to rip down and a time to build. So for each one of those, the destructive part is the first part of the sentence. And then the second part, you're building back up.
Yeah. So inside the verses, right, inside of a time to kill and a time to heal, it's destroy, fix, destroy, fix.
Right.
If you put verse 2 and verse 3 up against each other, you have fix, destroy, destroy, fix, destroy, fix.
Oh.
So you have chiastic parallelism between the verses, right? So this is the challenge. The art of Hebrew poetry is in part figuring out how to make that structure continue to appear, rather than rhyme scheme, rather than meter, rather than following the sonnet as a structure. It's, hey, how do we get this parallelism to work all the time? And then how do we get alliteration within the line? So, eight la ledet, eight la mut, eight la tat, eight la kornatua, right? Eight, so that you get this flow. If you pay really close attention to the bird song, turn, 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 you will notice that their chords do exactly the same thing. That in these verses where they're using the biblical book itself, they keep bouncing back and forth between the same two chords, line after line after line, until they get to the end of a verse as they've constructed it, and then they do a quick change to go to the chorus. But they keep bouncing back and forth as well. So they have picked up, as musicians, on how this is structured, which is to say Pete Seeger picked up on it, right? Because Pete Seeger is actually the writer for the music. Pete Seeger picked up on it and was able to make in the music what's happening underneath in the Hebrew, probably without having read the Hebrew ever to know what it said. And he's not around to ask, so. Nor is his brother. Okay, so those are kind of the characteristics of Ecclesiastes as literature, as biblical poetry to look at. And then what I've got for much of the rest of the presentation is really chunks of verses to kind of look at and pull apart and try to figure out, one, what's Ecclesiastes' worldview? Two, what does that mean for what he thinks we ought to do with our lives? And then three, and this is a really interesting question for humanistic Jews to consider, because we're frequently told Ecclesiastes is a forerunner. Is Ecclesiastes really a forerunner? Because I'm not convinced. And we'll see why I'm not convinced. And I'm interested to see, after we look at some of these, what your take on it is as well. So this is very early in the book. And he says, I made me great works. I built myself houses. I planted for myself vineyards, and I grew great, and I added more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom stayed with me. All my eyes sought, I did not withhold from them, nor did I deny my heart any merriment. For my heart was merry, from all my toil, and this was my share from my toil. I worked hard, I should benefit from it. And I turned about in all my deeds that my hands had done, and in the toil that I had toiled to do. And it seems like we're saying toil over and over and over, and we are, because the Hebrew uses the same word over and over and over. Right? So when I said we're going to repeat words and we're going to repeat sounds, he's doing it. And look, it was all mere breath and hurting the wind. And there was no gain under the sun. I worked really, really hard. My hands are now empty. I ate and drank and was happy, and now I'm bummed. But not just disappointed, but really empty feeling. And it seems weird to say hurting the wind, but that is actually kind of what the Hebrew says. People tend to translate this as catching the wind or something like that, but it really does say herding, like the idea that you could herd cats. It's the same kind of thing. I'm not sure whether cats or wind are harder to herd, but neither are easy. Later in that same chapter, I saw that wisdom surpasses folly as light surpasses darkness. The wise man has eyes in his head, and the fool goes in darkness. Yet I too knew that a single fate befalls them all. And I said in my heart that this too is mere breath, for there is no remembrance of the wise as with the fool forever. We get to the end of life, whatever your virtues, 20 years from now, no one knows who you are. Which is, again, kind of depressing. Ecclesiastes is kind of a depressing book. I guess I should have put this up front. Ecclesiastes is Ecclesiastes is a little bit of a bummer. There's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and sate himself with good things throughout his toil. This too I have seen, for it is from God's hand. For who will eat and who will feel, save me? For to the man who seems good before him, he has given wisdom and knowledge and merriment, but to the offender he has given the business of amassing and taking in to give to him who seems good before God. This too is mere breath and hurting the wind. So it seems like he's about to say, oh, good people benefit and bad people don't. And there's some balance to the world. And he says, but actually this is bad too. Everything is empty. It's all empty. Very, very empty. This is why rabbinic tradition says that this was written by Solomon at the end of his life, after he had ascended to great heights and virtue and then descended into sexual immorality and whatever else the Bible seems to attribute to him. He's gotten to the end of his life and he's gone, it was all pointless. That's rabbinic tradition's take on how we get this book. I know that whatever God does will be forever. You cannot add to it. You can't take away from it. God has acted also that they should fear him. That which has already been and what is already has been. That which already has been and what is to be already has been. And God seeks out the pursued. And further did I see under the sun the place of a judgment, wickedness there, and the place of justice, the wicked there. There is no justice in this world. That is Ecclesiastes' point the whole time. God gives benefits to those whom God wishes to benefit. God punishes those whom God wishes to punish. There's no rationale for it. And also, by the way, all of your judges are corrupt. I said in my heart, the just man and the wicked God will judge, for there is a time for every matter and every deed he assesses. So judges aren't to be trusted. God does what God wants. God will judge the good and the wicked. Maybe. Right? It seems like he's come to a conclusion with this. Oh, God will actually judge. As bounty multiplies, those who consume it multiply. And what is the benefit for its owner except what his eyes see? Sweet is the worker's sleep, whether he eats little or much, and the rich man's surfeit does not let him sleep. Better to be poor, Ecclesiastes says, than to be rich. Because when you're rich, you have so much stuff, you can't sleep because you're worried. Whereas poor people don't have anything and they sleep great. I am not convinced by this, but I suppose he was. There is a blighting evil I have seen under the sun, wealth kept for its own power, wealth kept for its owner for his harm. And that wealth is lost in a bad business, and he begets a son with nothing in his hand. As he came out from his mother's womb, naked will he return, to go as he came, and nothing will he bear off from his toil that he brings in his hand. You go into this world naked and you go out naked. And if you lose all of your money in business, that's really unfortunate for your kids. But also, remember, this is Kohelet, so what's he going to say? It's all mere breath anyway. This is always the answer. It's all mere breath. Also, the man whom God has given wealth and possessions, and whom he has empowered to enjoy it and bear off his share and delight in his toil, this is God's gift. Occasionally, somebody does well. You should enjoy it, but there's not any necessary reasoning for it that Kohelet identifies. So he has this kind of grim, random, repeating version of the world, right? There's a time for everything. A generation comes, a generation goes, and the world stands. Everything is vain. So what does he think you should do? So before we move on to that, do we have thoughts, questions? Corey.
Yes, perhaps this is a silly question, but you're repeatedly talking about this book as being one that's a bit depressing, and it sort of begs the question, why should one be interested in reading and understanding Ecclesiastes?
So what Ecclesiastes is good at, and it's part of why his book is depressing, is he really looks at the human condition writ large. And it's hard to, I'd have to retype the whole book in a way to get at everything that he looks at, because he will talk about watching generations of people come and go, and everybody works in this particular way. And then everybody seems to fall apart in this particular way. And I've watched it happen over and over and over and over and over. And while it's a bleak view, it's a view that a lot of people hold. It's a view that's easy to hold, particularly in bad times. And it gives an opportunity to think about what you do about it. You don't necessarily have to agree with what his decision is, but here's a biblical book that in 10 pages wraps up basically almost all of Albert Camus' philosophical corpus, right? Or, you know, the existentialists or whoever. It's like, oh, it's 10 pages, here you go.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Jack.
Well, it's an interesting text because it seems to me like it's some kind of precursor mixture of Calvinism and Buddhism, which is to say it is in part a statement against attachment, against commitment to the value of the things of this world. And then there's the element of, and we're not going to be able to figure out God's favor or will. God will do what God does, and we don't deserve it. So there's that kind of Calvinist notion mixed in. Seems interesting, even if all the words are concrete and non-abstract. It seems like an interesting philosophical exercise.
Marlene.
I'm also intrigued that in a way, God's not that important because, you know, God isn't going to, it's certainly not the common concept people say of you'll get your reward in the next life. There's no sense of that.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to hold.
Random.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to hold to that idea, right? That God likes who he likes and he dislikes who he dislikes, and you're just stuck with whatever it is. Yeah, so there is a big chunk of that happening. And then you're kind of left with the question, okay, well, now we have this sort of depressing view of the world from somebody who has reached an old age, and what does he now think we ought to do? I'm not spoiling anything if I say the answer is also a little bleak. So better a good name than good oil, and the day of death than the day one is born. Better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of carousing, for that is the end of all men. Let the living take it to heart. Better worry than merriment, for by a scowl the heart is gladdened. The wise man's heart is in the house of mourning, the heart of fools in the house of mirth. Better a thing's end than its beginning, better patience than haughtiness. So things are depressing. Why don't you just embrace it? Or that seems to be where he's going. And he will go back and forth between things are bleak, so embrace the bleakness, and embrace living well while you can, which is really his bottom line. And it's really his bottom line, and you can even see it here. So the end of all men, let the living take it to heart. Where was better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of carousing. By a scowl, the heart is gladdened. Are we sure about, like, that doesn't seem, on its face, that doesn't actually seem to be a very positive statement. Why would scowling gladden your heart? Except his point is, if you are benefiting from this world, enjoy it. Go to a house of mourning and realize this is where you're going to end. You can't take it with you. So if you're fortunate, you should use your fortune. And if you're unfortunate, well, you don't have the worries of somebody with a fortune, which as well seems a little bit Calvinist and a little bit Buddhist. Everything have I seen in my days of mere breath. Again, mere breath, right? So even as he's giving you what his prescription for life is, he's saying, remember, this is all pointless. Nevertheless, here's my suggestion. Everything have I seen in my days of mere breath, the righteous perishing in his righteousness and the wicked living a long life in his evil. Not something that's typically acknowledged in the biblical text, that the formula that is sometimes used doesn't work. Don't be over righteous and don't be over wise. Why should you be dumbfounded? Don't be over wicked and don't be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you seize this, and from the other as well. Do not take back your hand, for he who fears God will get out of them all. So we're watching in real time as he struggles. This is another reason to look at it, is you can see in it the process many people go through in working through the idea of a just world or a not just world, a just God or a not just God. He's working through it almost in real time. Like, you can read it and see that same thing mirrored in the literature right in front of you, and in fairly solid ways, right? Because he's a materialist. All that your hand manages to do with your strength, do. For there is no doing, nor reckoning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in Sheol where you are going. So we haven't mentioned Sheol yet. Sheol is not hell. Sheol is not heaven. Sheol is a netherworld that is described as gray and shadowy and dusty. essentially. And for much of the Hebrew Bible, there's no heaven and hell, and there's no afterlife. Really, there's Sheol. So he actually is reflecting a fairly traditional Israelite religious view that there's this kind of netherworld, and that's where we go. And the netherworld is not great. There's no doing, nor reckoning, nor knowledge and wisdom, nor does man know his time, like a fish caught in an evil net, and like birds held in a trap. Like them, the sons of man are ensnared by an evil time when it suddenly falls upon them. Nothing happens in Sheol. This is when you can live, so you should do it. Should a man live many years, let him rejoice, and let him recall the days of darkness, for there will be many, right? So this is we saw this with the heart is gladdened by a scowl. As you're living a good part of your life, know that it's good in comparison to bad parts of your life, and appreciate the good that you have now. Whatever comes is mere breath. It's all passing. Rejoice in your youth, and let your heart be merry, and go about in the ways of your heart. But know that for all these, God will bring to you judgment, and remove every worry from your heart, and take evil away from your flesh, for youth and the time of vigor are mere breath. Your youth is passing. We've heard that many times. Youth fades. Ecclesiastes pessimism lives forever. That is a terrible marketing strategy, by the way. Don't adopt that. So let's stop. What's his point? What do we kind of think he's getting at? Joyce.
Is he trying to say appreciate the things that you have and understand that life is fleeting?
That seems to be a big part of it, right? He's not really an optimist. He's not really a pessimist. Exactly. He does think we're all going to one end, but his view isn't all that different from much of the rest of the Tanakh. So his view there isn't really exceptional. We have in our head the idea that there's heaven and hell in the Tanakh, but it's really only in the book of Daniel, and only kind of, unless you're interpreting more liberally with rabbinic interpretive ideas. Sheol is kind of what there is. So it's passing. And the best that you can do is, when you're doing well, live well, because you could make a bad business deal and it's all gone and your child has nothing. Which is why we have life insurance and estate planning. I feel like, since I used to practice law, I feel like I have to say, call your estate planner. Don't let that happen to your family.
Ask a question?
Jack.
Yeah, is another point the just the process of trying to work this out, to, as you were saying, Jeremy, in kind of real time, grappling with important and ancient and then modern issues, by kind of thinking through the writing of it. It reminds me, though this is Ecclesiastes, much more poetical. In order to try to escape the bubble, I regularly read a blogger named Rod Dreher, who is a Christian conservative writer. And he talks about, he blogs prolifically, and he says to his readers, bear with me, because the way I think through issues is to write about them. And it seems to me like the author, or authors, I don't know, of Ecclesiastes were thinking through issues by writing about them. So there's a kind of process point here.
Yeah, and then it seems to have gotten refined, right? Because the repetitive language, there's a refinement period that happened here, where the language got more pointed, right? So there's, Abraham Lincoln is reputed to have said, there's no evidence he actually said this, but he's reputed to have said, If I had more time, I'd have written you a shorter letter.
Right.
Right? We don't know that he actually said it, but the idea of, okay, I did all this, now I'm going to smooth it over, but I'm still preserving that real-time motion, right, that Jack was talking about. So is he religious as we define it? It seems hard to say that. He talks about God controlling outcomes, but he doesn't see that there's any justice to it. Continual references to the idea of everything being breath, but also being judged by God, right? It doesn't all hold together as like a philosophy of life. But there's no doing or reckoning, nor wisdom, nor knowledge in Sheol, where you are going, which is a very traditional Israelite religious concept. And that which already has been, and what is to be already has been, and God seeks out the pursued, and there's nothing new under the sun. So he obviously thinks there are cycles. He obviously thinks there are times when things are appropriate. And that can be a secular view, but some of this other stuff is not especially what we would necessarily call secular. One way of clarifying some of this is to know that the wisdom literature in the Tanakh is not fully unique, that other ancient Near Eastern civilizations had comparable literature. And they had comparable literature in religious places. So this is in a tomb, an Egyptian tomb. These are excerpts. It's a much longer piece, and it's written in the tomb next to a picture of a harper. So this is obviously supposed to have some kind of musical element to it. And it says, one generation passes away and the next remains. Ever since the times of old, the gods who existed before me rest now in their tombs, and the blessed nobles are also buried in their tombs. So rejoice your heart. The weary-hearted one does not hear their lamentations, and their weeping does not rescue a man's heart from the grave. Enjoy pleasant times and do not weary. Behold, it is not given to any man to take his belongings with them. Behold, there is no one departed who will return again. If it had been in Hebrew, Ecclesiastes could have copied. And we have a very traditional, this is the god of the underworld in the Egyptian pantheon, Osiris. So it's possible to have genuinely religious texts that are, from what our perspective would be, quite skeptical. So that Ecclesiastes is representing a darker view of what may be a fairly standard set of Israelite beliefs, not necessarily ones that we think of as typical religion, but our thought about typical religion is because we live in a highly Protestant society. But this is traditional ancient Near Eastern religious belief, is what we're seeing here in the Egyptian document is also in Ecclesiastes. This is another text that we'll look at more when we study Job, called the Babylonian Theodicy, and it's an exchange between a person who's suffering and the person's friend. And the person suffering has said, I've looked around, the evidence is contrary. God does not impede the way of the devil. A father drags his boat along the canal and his firstborn lies in bed. Right? These unhappy contradictions. The friend responds, respected friend, what you say is gloomy. You let your mind dwell on evil. You make your fine discretion like an imbecile's. You have reduced your beaming face to scowls. So here's that tension. And then Psalm 88 has it. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise to praise you? Are your wonders made known in the netherworld, your beneficent deeds in the land of oblivion? we think of the Psalms as uplifting. Psalm 88 is in no respect an uplifting text. It never, many Psalms take a positive turn toward the end. Psalm 88 is not going there with us. It is not making a positive turn. It ends shortly after this. But again, traditional Israelite religious ideas are right here, and they sound a lot like Ecclesiastes. So we tend to think of Ecclesiastes as the things he says feel modern. His observations feel modern. Traditional Israel religion may have been more sophisticated than we tend to think of as just, oh, well, kill a bull because God says so, right? That's a lot of what we carry into it. And it's actually a lot more sophisticated, and it looks a lot more like the more sophisticated societies around it. The rabbis believed that he was fairly traditionally religious from their perspective. There's this passage, these passages at the end that seem kind of glued on. More than being wise, Kohelet taught knowledge to the people. The last word, all being heard, fear God and keep his commands, for that is all humankind, since every deed God bring to judgment, for every hidden act, be it good or evil. So most modern scholars think that this has been tacked on.
Huh.
It's not written much like the rest of Ecclesiastes. It doesn't convey quite the same mood. It stops talking about mere breath. But it was enough so that Rashi in the 1000s commenting on it could say the words of Kohelet. So this is how the book opens, the words of Kohelet. Every place where it is said, the words of, these are words of rebuke. And then he lists a bunch of places from Deuteronomy. These are the words of Moses that he spoke to the people of Israel on Mount Horeb. And now I'm going to remind you of all the rules. So this is Rashi saying, same thing. This is King Solomon reminding you of the rules. I have this ending that I can hang my hat on, and I have this beginning that I'm going to say is like all the other beginnings. And this is what makes it work in the biblical canon, is actually it's not saying all that much that's problematic from a traditional Israelite perspective. So it kind of works. The worldview is okay from a biblical perspective. We're accustomed to thinking of it as much edgier than it maybe really is. So the question I leave you with, because I see we're over time, is how much of a precedent is Ecclesiastes for us in from a skeptical, humanistic, secular perspective? I'm not 100% sure the outcome is, although the speculations are. This is my perspective, right? The process we recognize. The outcome, I think, actually we don't recognize as us. Because he clearly does, he doesn't think that there's going to be a balancing out, but he holds these very traditional ideas and he doesn't reject them. And what seems to be like a very skeptical book has a whole chapter that talks about what God does in the world. And it may just be that he says it's unjust, but that is what it is. And that's not different in very many ways from what anybody in the ancient Near East thought about religion. So that's what I have. Job will be a little more nerve-wracking, as Job is. Any questions, follow-up thoughts? I know we kind of really blazed through Ecclesiastes, but I wanted to get us done in an hour. Yeah, Marlene.
Yeah, I'm just curious about why periodically we get, but God is going to judge everything. I mean, if it's all mere breath, what the heck is he judging? And why do I care that he's judging?
Yeah.
This seems very contradictory.
Yeah, and I think that part of the contradictory element to it is he knows there's not an answer, but he has a framework that it fits in, which is there's not a heaven and hell. There's this dusky end to everything. Everybody goes to the same place, and that's the answer. Suitably grim. So, Joyce.
So I was just interested in his concept of God, because clearly he thinks there is a God there, but or it sounds he's at least talking as if there's one there, but whoever that God is doesn't sound very loving or maybe very fair, because he's judging good people and bad people similarly. Is that, I mean, that I'm curious as to how that concept of that type of God matches up with what people were thinking back then.
I am not sure that we should think that they had that concept of God. That punishment is rewarded, good things are rewarded, bad things are punished. It's clearly not what was in ancient Egypt. It's not what was in Babylonia. We know there are issues with it in Job. And the Torah seems to take this idea and shift it to the entire body politic, to say it's not a question of individual stuff. You're going to be punished maybe or not, but the nation will prosper if they follow my rules. I'm not making any guarantees about the person. I'm not a slot machine, right? The Torah would say God is not, the Torah wouldn't use I'm not a slot machine, but that's kind of what it's saying, right? You don't put a quarter in and then you get something right back out. It's much more, it's complicated and they know it, but they're not Greek philosophers, so they don't use that language. And Kohelet, we see, doesn't use that language, but he still is getting at that same, this is not actually predictable. And I recognize it is not predictable. So John.
So I have trouble understanding this, and I'm asking for your help in understanding. So one of the things I've always had trouble with religion, as it's come down to me, is the sort of the dualism, that it's all light versus dark, and we're all sort of players in this gigantic war between good and evil and light and dark. And to me, what he seems to be saying sounds liberating at one level. He seems to be saying, don't worry about being a foot soldier in this ongoing war between good and evil, on being a soldier on God's side in this forever war. Just live your life. But then on another level, he seems to be saying that just it's all already been written, and God is in control of everything, and what you do is not relevant. So I'm trying to sort that out, because on the one hand, it does seem kind of liberating. He doesn't say you have this role to play in this cosmic war. Am I making any sense?
Yeah. So I think these are, for him, they're two sides of the same coin. There's a thing that's deciding all of this, and it's not you. So you go ahead and do what you're going to do. It will turn out or not, and that's not fully in your control. And we know that's not, and that's not in your control. I know it's not I know it's not in your control. Do what you're going to do. And there are some things that can make your life easier if you follow them. So maybe you do those things, but not because it's going to determine the outcome of the world or determine the outcome of your soul, but simply because it might make your life less miserable right now. And that's the base level of advice that he's got, is don't be miserable right now. Here's my suggestion for how not to be miserable. Think really hard about how people can be miserable and you're not miserable right now, and feel happy you're not miserable right now. There's no bigger ontological tie than that.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Is everybody Bibled out? Oh, Norm, yeah.
Yeah. For some other time, I'd be interested. In chapter 2, there's discussions about how, yeah, I've had some male slaves, I've had female slaves, male and female entertainers, and apparently that's not a permanent condition for him. They had them and done whatever he needs to do with them. Sometime I'd love to hear what the rabbinic commentary on those sections might be. I know it wasn't really your pitch tonight.
Yeah, I haven't read that section yet.
But just one quick question. Do you think he's saying that you should fear God, that God will judge you, or not?
I don't think he really has a conclusion to that.
Yeah.
I think his point is more, God decides to let people benefit or not based on God's own perception of things. Forget even speculating on it, right? So I'm not even going to get, his seems to be saying, I'm not even going to get into it, but I am telling you, look at the world in a particular way and act in a way that reflects, you're going to come to nothing at the end. That's the lesson underneath. And we want to theologize it, make it something much bigger, because of course, we've been told all these things about how the Bible works in theology and civilization, but that's a particular mindset we have. It's not necessarily the mindset of those who compose these texts. Okay, well, we are at 8:41, and I don't want to hold anyone long, so I will let everyone go for the night.